Steve Brayshaw from Ronstan Australia. Today I was joined by Ben Moon from Ronstan USA to interview our good mate Glenn Ashby, the skipper of America's Cup team, Emirates Team New Zealand, and also A-Class Catamaran World Champion 10 times over. We spoke about the America's Cup and A-Class Catamaran setups. I hope you enjoy.
So welcome, Glenny. Thank you for joining myself and Ben to have a quick chat about the A-Class and what we're doing with the A-Class these days and how things are working. But I think it'd be rude not to ask you about how the Cup's going. What's happening over there in New Zealand, and yeah, fill us in.
Yeah, well, look, everything's been pretty crazy over the last sort of 2 or 3 months, I guess. But since sort of getting out of lockdown, I guess over here in New Zealand, we've been fortunate to get back on the water on our small 12-metre test boat, and that's been a fantastic little tool for us to sort of carry on the testing and development of equipment and parts and foils that we'll be likely to sort of look at using on both boat one and also the second race boat at 75 scale. So look, the AC 75's actually just arrived back today, actually here in Auckland, and did a bit of a world tour without doing any sailing, which is a bit of a shame. But that was unforeseen at the time, when we sent that away. But it's been good over here. We've had probably a couple of weeks back on the water since lockdown, and had some fantastic conditions. And the 12-metre boat that we sail, we only sail with 4 instead of 11 on the big boat. So it's a totally different sort of type of sailing and a different type of day on the water. But we're learning a lot over here, and we were actually planning on sailing the 12-metre quite a lot while the big boat was away anyway. So not a whole lot's changed for us as far as the testing program here in Auckland. But certainly really missed out on doing those regattas in Europe, initially in England, and I think all the teams would have been really looking forward to doing some racing against each other, to sort of test yourselves and your team, and learn. It would have been a great opportunity to sort of judge how you were going and how everyone else was going. But right now we've got to wait until we see everyone later in the year, so it almost sort of adds to the anticipation, if you like, as to what everyone's going to turn up with, and we'll certainly keep it exciting for sure.
So, Glennie, what's the biggest difference between the foiling mono and the cats?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of similarities, Ben, but also a lot of differences as well. Probably the down speed sailing on the monohull is where the biggest difference is between the cats and the monohull. Once the monohull's sort of up to speed and you gain the riding moment from the foil and then eventually pop out of the water, the power comes on really quite quickly, and the boats are pretty powerful as far as their riding moment is concerned. So the upwind performance of the boats is pretty spectacular, and would be in many cases far in excess of what the cats were. But the wing sails and the cats were very efficient, sort of in lighter air and in displacement mode. So when the hull is in the water on a catamaran, you're pretty much at your max riding moment as soon as you can lift the windward hull out of the water. Whereas on the monohull, you don't have a lot of riding moment until you sort of get going a little bit quicker, and then the foil starts to lift and take over, and that's when the power comes on. So slightly different techniques of how to sail the boat, but when you're up and ripping, it's quite similar in many respects.
Do you get a sense of the scale? Like, I mean, we all sailed A-Class, and that feels fast, but you're on this big 70. Does it feel faster? Like what?
Yeah, look, the 75 definitely feels quick. Particularly upwind. Downwind, the speeds are fairly similar, because you sort of run into the cavitation zone in the sort of mid to high 40s. You can set your foils up to go a bit quicker, but then you pay a penalty in the slower boat speeds and lighter winds. So it's just sort of picking that window accurately with your foil package. But the upwind performance is where I think these boats have probably surprised everybody in how well they actually go upwind. You're not that much slower upwind than you are downwind, to be honest. And Obviously the apparent wind speed that you sort of create upwind, power sort of almost creates power, and with the riding moment that you've got and being able to cant the foils out a little bit wider for the upwind, it's really, the boats are extremely efficient, and I think aerodynamically they're quite clean and tidy as well. And it's been impressive. If you're down to leeward on one of these boats in between the jib slot and the main going upwind, it's like you're in a hurricane. You've probably got over 100 kilometres an hour of breeze going over your helmet. So it's you definitely know you're going upwind. That's for sure. It's cool, but you have to have full head protection and ear protection, because you're just simply without having that on, you just can't hear anything. So the communication side of things is massively important on how you sail a boat. So noise cancelling sort of headphones and that sort of thing are a must on these boats.
It's got to be pretty daunting, because you guys are really pioneering a whole new style of sailing. Like with the last boats, the Cats, you had the C class, so you kind of understood how wings are going, and these are different, very different.
Yeah, look, it's been a massive learning curve from day one, but I think one of the things that has been really pleasing with the way that the concept, if you like, has been proven to work is just how manoeuvrable the boats are, and I think how well the match racing and the actual racing side of things will be. The tacks and the jibes on the foils, the way that the sails can be handled, and the way the twin skin mainsail also works, uprange. The sail simply doesn't flap like a single membrane sail would. Being able to separate the high and low pressure sides of the sail in a soft sense means that you can tack and the mainsail doesn't flap, or you can be doing 35 knots upwind, for example, in 20 knots of breeze, and the battens won't flog, or the sail shape doesn't blow around so much. So the rig is very, very clean and tidy. The twin skin mainsail concept develops roughly 20% more power than what a sort of single membrane sail would. So with the self-righting capability of the boat, meaning that if we could, the shorter the mast, we could get away with having less lead or weight down in the foils to self-right the boat. So the rig would need to be 6 or 8 metres taller if it was a single membrane sail to generate the same sort of power. But that means you need a lot more weight down the bottom to actually get the boat back upright again. So with that rule in place, with a more powerful, shorter rig, if you like, overall, increase the performance of the boat. And it's really interesting. It's a really new learning curve for everybody, and I think what will come of this will be, the racing will be absolutely spectacular, and I think people will be blown away with the acceleration and how the boats will be able to interact at high speed. I think it'll be pretty exciting sailing for sure.
Yeah, Glenn, one last AT question. Obviously, you pioneered some pretty innovative sort of control systems for the foils on the catamarans. Has there been a quantum leap in control designs for the foils on these boats relative to 4 years ago?
Yeah, look, I think, Ben, it's a great question. I think there certainly has been some iterations, if you like, of where we were. Obviously on the AC50s, for example, and the AC72s back in San Francisco days, the whole daggerboard would rake, so the whole daggerboard case sort of raked, whereas we've got the opportunity with these foils to have a sort of a flap mechanism similar to a moth that can be adjusted. So the whole arm doesn't have to move. So the flight control of the boat, if you like, can be done quite a lot more efficiently. Although that's all powered, by batteries, the whole foil cant system and the flaps, the control probably ultimately is a little better. The boat still, has to be flown manually, and it's a challenge for sure. And there's a lot to learn. And as you're learning to sail a moth or an A-Cat or other boats, you have some spills and some capsizes, and you have to learn where the edge is to be able to push the boat hard and sail well. So we're certainly going through all those learning iterations at the moment. And again, you always wish you had more time to develop more and to learn more, but at the end of the day, you have to put a line in the sand and learn to use the gear that you have well. And for sure, when the America's Cup comes around next year, we'll wish we had another, couple of months or even a couple of years to keep developing, but everyone will be in the same situation. So it's just a matter of making the best decisions with the time frame that you have, and hopefully you'll be faster than your opponents.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you giving us some insight into the AC life. It's quite the mystery. Everyone tries to keep it secret because they want to get to the finish line first. They don't want to let any, secrets out. So, but I suppose we get into the guts of it now, because we're here to talk about A-Class and, things that the A-Class do and why they do it. And who better to speak to than the god of A-Class, 10-time world champion. So, I suppose the three of us, all being, A-Class sailors, know a fair bit about the boats, and we've been to many of the recent events. But one of the most talked about points at the moment is the rudders, because it's possibly the newest element that's gone onto the boat is the adjustable rudders. And one of the elements of the adjustable rudders is being able to put them into differential. And you were one of the first guys to do that at Hervey Bay Worlds. And basically, what is it? How does it work? And when do you use it?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously, A-Class has been a fantastic development class over the years, and there's always, new learnings with the boats, as there is in many other classes. And I guess some of the experience that we had over the years with the A-Cat, but also with other catamarans, and certainly the AC50. As a sort of a group, if you like, with Ray, Pete, Blair, and myself, we sort of, I guess, identified some things, with the A-Cat that we could potentially do better. And really, one of the things with the adjustable rudders that we thought would make a big difference. Obviously, everyone had sailed moths. We knew the importance of having, accurate trim on the rudder versus the front foil. So that was something that we were, had identified quite a long time ago, but, had been out of the class for 2 or 3 years, so hadn't sort of put that into play, and no one else had, so it was okay. But one of the biggest things with the rudders was the differential side of things. So not only the importance of being able to re-trim the boat from upwind to downwind, but the extra righting moment generated by being able to use rudder differential would effectively, load the rig more, and increase your power and your thrust forward. So, the A-Cat is a fairly narrow boat. So being able to generate a little bit more riding moment ultimately, makes you a little bit quicker. So with having to drag the elevators through the water anyway, being able to use differential, you don't pay a huge drag penalty for actually dragging those elevators through the water. At a few degrees angle of attack, it's not a massive drag penalty, but it can really change the downforce, if you like, on the windward side. It's your leeward elevator and your windward elevator. The boat will always trim around the sort of the middle setting of what those are. So, we had basically set up on those boats in Hervey Bay a system that you could rake the rudders fore and aft to adjust the overall sort of trim or pitch of the boat, but then we also had a separate control that could actually adjust the differential or the offset between the windward and leeward one. So we would adjust that, but the trim of the boat would stay the same because you'd move the leeward one and the windward one at exactly the same amount. So you'd either add, for example, you'd add 2 degrees on the leeward one and you'd take 2 degrees off the windward one, or vice versa. So that kept the trim of the boat the same, and you could wind that offset in or take it out depending on the conditions. If you put too much offset in, you would pay a drag penalty if you're at a slow speed. So there was a limit, and the foils sort of fall off the cliff, and you start to pull the handbrake on if you use too much too early. And alternatively, if you're not using enough, then and your opponent is, then they'll be a little bit quicker. So it's just working out where those boundaries are, and different elevators and different sizings will mean different settings for different boats. So that's where the joy is with the A-Cat. There's always something to learn, something to try, and some big lessons. And I think ultimately, probably the pitch adjustability was probably one of the biggest things for accurate upwind foiling, and then the offset or the differential was really the icing on the cake for actually getting you another couple of knots quicker upwind.
Glenn, obviously there's running differential on the rudders makes sense. And considering a majority of the lift on an A-Cat comes from its centreboards and its rudders, sort of a combination of two, is there ever a consideration to go and work differential, work centreboard rake positions independently instead of the same?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something that the Olympic guys on the NACRA do quite a lot. I think that's one of the sort of the the things that those guys do a lot more, because they can't adjust their rudders like we can on the A-Cat. So they actually start, they've learnt a lot and were playing around a lot with their dagger boards. I think it's certainly something that can be done on the A-Cat, and a lot of the guys have played with that before. For us in Hervey Bay, we didn't have adjustable offset, if you like, in the dagger boards. We just had a simple rate control, but we found that at that particular time, just the rudder differential itself would generate so much change in power that having another string to adjust the dagger board rate, we already had a few on there, that we just learned how to sail with the rudders quite well. And yeah, it's certainly something in the future that could be connected up, but something we didn't play with at the time, but something definitely on the table for the future.
So adding the extra riding moment, so basically putting an extra 20 kilos or something like that on your shoulders to help pull the boat over on top of you and give you that windward heel, is that was what you're after?
Yeah, so look, basically it's a speed related thing. So the faster you go, the more load you get through the elevators, the more that's more riding moments. So there would come a point where you would get going if you were sort of doing 18 to 20 knots upwind, for example, which are sort of typical type numbers. Your riding moment goes up, but your rig loads go up as well. So your main sheet load goes up. Everything gets a lot more loaded, but you're going faster through the water. So your steering and the way you sailed the boat had to be very, very accurate, when you were going quicker and so much load. It was hard to trim the main sheet as much as you would do on the downwind, for example, where you'd be a little bit less loaded. So we learnt a lot. You could easily overload parts on the boat. That was probably one of the biggest things we learnt. We did break quite a few little bits and pieces, running too much load, particularly downwind. If you're running too much offset, it's very easy to get caught windward heel and not be able to recover from that, and you'd actually roll out into almost a Chinese jibe. Generally upwind, we would use more offset than we would use downwind. There's times actually where you'd in lighter conditions, you'd actually slightly reverse the offset to actually help the windward hull pop out of the water, and you'd use your body weight more to actually move the boat forward. So there's definitely lighter conditions where you could actually even slightly reverse the offset, which we played with a little bit as well. So, at the end of the day, we're only probably scratching the surface. We're only there for a couple of weeks testing it all, and I think the knowledge that a lot of people would have now would be probably far greater than what we potentially have on what settings were good. But we certainly learned a lot, and being able to retrim the boat around and really load the elevators with your weight aft in the light conditions, using quite a lot of daggerboard rake as well, felt quite efficient downwind. And I think we were foiling downwind at times in sort of 5.5 or 6 knots of wind speed. So myself being a little bit lighter, you sort of foil probably in slightly lighter conditions, but the bigger guys always do well upwind. So it's always been a battle to hang on to the big guys upwind and then try and do some damage downwind. But I don't think anything's going to change. That's fast, Steve.
That's it. Yeah, me and Volker loved it. So go Ben.
Glenn, so obviously you're talking a lot about the nuances of the A-Cat and what all the foils do. Is there a trickle up, trickle down? Like, did you learn a lot from the A-Cat that you could put into use on the AC50s, or was it the other way around? Would you sail the AC50s and go, oh, this works, let's try it on the A, or a bit of both?
Yeah, look, it was certainly something we talked about quite a lot on the A. Really, at the time, it was probably the more effort that we put in at the time was probably more on the AC50. You're allowed basically 3 degrees offset on the AC50, and we were doing, everything we could to increase that within the rules, obviously. So we found, initially that Oracle last campaign had loosened their lower shrouds off quite a lot, which actually let the platform rack about a degree more, which would give you a degree more offset. So that obviously loaded the rig up a lot more. So you had to, adjust your spar laminate to cope with that extra loading. They did that. We also had sort of, almost divergent elevators that would sort of flex a little bit in the correct way that you're wanting to go. But, a divergent elevator will only stay divergent until it breaks. So it'll keep diverging if you go too quick and you have too much angle of attack on that. So knowing the settings and knowing how far you could push those elevators before they'd rip off the back of the boat was a tricky one. And the engineers and the designers, were doing a fantastic job of pushing the boundaries there. And, all teams were, when you'd see an elevator disappear, it was generally because it was an elevator that had been pushed over its limit to where it was able to cope with the strains and the stresses. So basically, differentials it's a speed-related problem. The speed squared, the loading goes up massively. So you only need to do 1 or 2 knots quicker, and the loadings can go through the roof. So it's the same on the A-Cat. If you're doing 20 knots and then you speed up to doing 25 knots, the loading on the boat or the riding moment increase goes up exponentially. So you can get caught in situations where you literally can't slow down, and you risk actually blowing the rudder or the elevator off the back of the boat, or blowing yourself off the boat, one or the other. But it's a learning curve, and I think the manufacturers in the A-Cat, I think, have done a fantastic job over the last few years of the build quality and the ability to push what is really the Formula One of single-handed catamaran sailing, to push that to a level where you can push the boats hard and sail them accurately and not have breakages has been a great job from all the manufacturers. And I think at the end of the day, the A-Cat will, as it always has done in the past, continue to get faster and faster and more developed over the years. And that's absolutely the beauty about the A-Cat, and I think why so many of us simply love sailing the boats.
Just a final one with the rudders. So you're using them both uphill and downhill, the differential. You've got it set in for going up and down?
Yeah, so generally you'll be running, a certain amount of differential upwind, around sort of 5 to 6 degrees is what we were typically using. On
the leeward hull, or that's the offset?
That's the offset. Total. So that's the offset. So roughly
you'd be going into a negative on the windward?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So, and that's probably why you guys went symmetrical winglet shapes, because anything with a bit of lift in it wouldn't be loving going into negative?
Yeah, look, an asymmetric shape, you can be slightly asymmetric, but generally a symmetric section has slightly lower drag than an asymmetric section. So, a symmetric section at an angle of attack is still a pretty clean shape, whereas an asymmetric foil at a negative angle of attack is generally not that good. Generally, you're lifting on the back on the A-Cat, but there is times where you're actually producing downforce as well. So the symmetric sections are generally the ones that you choose.
Yeah, just great insight into the rudders, and look, hopefully it's helped a lot of people out there understand it. So I think we'll move on to the next, topic of discussion is the centreboards. The centreboards have been through some fairly different shapes over the last, since 2013 when we started first foiling over in New Zealand. So I think one builder's up to Z28 or something like that now. So there's been a fair few different shapes come in with all sorts of different benefits and different elements. Sometimes people are lifting the windward board, like we saw at the beginning when foiling first came in. So have you got any insights on what shapes are working and what's been a benefit out there?
Yeah, look, I think one of the, obviously with the sort of the rule constraints, if you like, of having to enter the foils from the deck and not have the tips closer than 750 mils from centerline has in a way, kept the foils, within a sort of certain limit or a certain profile, if you like. But I think probably one of the biggest advances over the last few years has probably been in section shapes and the way the foils are actually, the way they twist and how they actually tip load. I think the section shape side of things has been a big development, and I think the heave stability, if you like, or the vertical stability of the boats up and down, I think it's probably been the biggest gain in the class. The early days of foiling was sort of a very unstable sort of hop, skip and jumps downwind, whereas nowadays with the continued development, the foils are much more heave stable than they used to be. I think a lot more efficient as well, so lower drag, higher performance. And
also the separation from rudder to centreboards probably made a big difference.
Yep, the balance of that with the centre of effort of the rig, absolutely. And I think again, daggerboard development in all classes, going forward, will continue to go on as knowledge is increased and as people are trying new things. So again, I think it's one of the beauties of the class is that you can, fairly cheaply and easily in relative terms, do some pretty big developments and learn the good, the bad, or the ugly, out of the foils. And certainly that's something that I think really stands the A-Cat apart to a lot of other boats, is that we foil on with both our daggerboards down, and it means that your manoeuvrability, but also your performance, because the boats are so efficient, is great. So there's not too many other boats out there that would be quicker than an A-Cat upwind these days, I don't think, in a catamaran sense.
No, well, that's right. I mean, I know I've seen 25 knots while sailing uphill. It was hell scary, and it didn't end well after 25 knots. But it's definitely an experience when you've got you're sailing in an 18 knot breeze and you're doing 25 knots uphill. Theoretically you've got 40 knots coming across the bow. Whew. Yeah, you know about it. So
I was going to say, so Glenn, you were touching on foil section shapes is obviously pretty important, and then the heave stability. That's really generated off surface area. Is that correct? And I know that in the AC stuff, there was a lot of development in the size of the foils. Is that the trend you're seeing with the A-Cats? Like, obviously, we started out with these big area foils, and now we're getting smaller and smaller, which is good in some conditions. Would you ever see a point where we'd end up having, a couple of different sets of foils for different conditions?
Yeah, look, I think so, for sure. I think, like, if you were targeting a light air regatta, you'd probably have a slightly different set of foils than you would do for a full up-range regatta. But with the A-Cat, you have to get through a range of conditions, and generally over a series or a regatta, you will have a mixture of conditions. So, an all-purpose or an AP set of foils is really what you're after on an A-Cat. You want something that, same with the rig, you want a rig or a boat set up that can go through a range of conditions. Yes, you can tailor it to slightly lighter air or slightly heavier air, but the foils, really, the heave stability, just getting back to that quickly, is largely generated by the side force of the foils. So the profile and the way the section shapes and the way the actual span efficiency or the span loading of those foils, that dictates sort of your heave stability. So as you get higher out of the water, the foils basically, lose a little bit of lift, and the boat will come down to sort of a natural heave. And depending on your rake setting, your angle of attack of a platform, that will, and your body positioning, that will dictate whether you go up or down or fly stably. So, whilst on most small boats, particularly without having sort of active flap control like on a Moth, your weight shifting as you sail into puffs and lulls and shifts, and also sea state, you have to move your body weight around. But having a foil that largely has a natural sort of inherent heave stability, makes the boat that little bit easier to sail. So it's always a trade-off between performance and sort of fly time, if you like. It's very easy to foil slowly, which we've seen on other boats in the past, where you're clearly foiling, but you're just slow. So the trick is to be fast, just sort of in control, if you like, but be able to foil relatively consistently. And that's really, from a designer's perspective, what you're trying to achieve with the A-Cat foils is something that's easy to sail, but still fast, but gives you the ultimate performance.
Now settings-wise for your uphill and downhill, like I know that I had more centerboard lift in going downhill, and then I would definitely come around the bottom mark and adjust it just to bring that bow down, because kind of wanted the bow up like you would do on a moth. You'd get rid of a bit of rudder lift so that bows up just to stop it, maybe tipping over the edge and going bow in. So did you have any insights onto what you would do settings for uphill versus downhill on the centerboards?
Yeah, so one of the big advantages, I think, with having the adjustable sort of rudder system, if you like, both in offset and in trim, was largely you could, in sort of medium conditions, call it sort of 10 to 14 knots, you could largely set and forget your daggerboard rake for your upwind trim, and then you could adjust the trim of the boat, which would effectively adjust the angle of attack on the daggerboards by adjusting your trim. You could come into the top mark and you could basically lower the back of the boat down slightly as you went into a downwind setting. You could get, as you came into the bottom mark or just rounding the mark, you'd actually put the main sheet and the tiller in one hand, reach down, and you'd actually adjust your rudder trim as you were turning around the mark to basically put the boat into a fairly level trim. Obviously, upwind, the bow wants to go up, and downwind, the bow wants to go down. So by adjusting the rudder trim, you effectively negated the need to really have to adjust the daggerboard rate around the track. And there were some races at Harvey Bay where you'd sail around the whole track with the daggerboards in exactly the same setting, and you'd just be adjusting the rudders, to get your trim correct for the conditions. So in lighter breeze, you would need to, if in displacement sailing, for example, where you weren't foiling upwind, but you were foiling downwind, you'd reduce the the daggerboard rake for the upwind, and then you'd crank it on, 2 or 3 degrees for the downwind, but also lift the back of the boat as well. So you'd be lifting the back and lifting the front to actually be able to get the boat to foil in those lighter conditions. So the lighter conditions is probably where you adjust the daggerboard rake the most from upwind to downwind. But the windier it gets, generally, you go through sort of a mid-range where you don't adjust the daggerboards much, and then you'll get to a point where it gets sort of fresh to frightening, sort of call it 17 knots plus, where you'll actually need to lower the back of the boat down even further. So if you do touch down, you've got a little bit of hull support to pierce through waves, and that's where you need to adjust the daggerboards a little bit to find that sort of nice balance of foiling, but also a little bit bow up downwind. And then as you get around the bottom mark, you actually need to reduce the daggerboard rake a little bit more for the real breezy stuff upwind, because you have quite a lot more aero drag on the rig going upwind in the windier conditions. So I'd sort of say, as a general rule of thumb, between 10 and 15 knots, you shouldn't, in my opinion, you shouldn't really have to adjust your daggerboard rake around the track if you're adjusting your rudder rake correctly.
Perfect. That's great. Less touching of things is the better, I reckon. All right. Well, I think we should just move on to the next topic, because time's critical and you're a busy man. Rigs, and this one's close to your heart because you're a designer and manufacturer of certain parts of the rig, being the sail. We've seen some big changes. We've gone really big heads back in the 2010 sort of area, and then as we're now come up to quite pinheads back to early days of A class. So can you explain to us what's happened there?
Yeah, look, the big head sails really sort of came about, when we were sort of doing the wild thing downwind, if you like, sort of sailing on one hull, and you're wanting to downwind be able to raise the centre of effort or raise the power up high to then be able to almost trapeze downwind, but still with a lot of tipping moments. So you could sail, slightly deeper, but on one hull, potentially either hiking or sitting on the high side or even trapezing downwind, still hull in the water. As we moved into a more sort of foiling orientated zone, if you like, we simply downwind didn't need the power up high. We were already up and going, we're foiling, and we just needed a clean profile, of sail, and we actually needed a little bit more power down low potentially to actually just make the boat go forward. So it wasn't about tipping it over, it was just about actually allowing the boat to go forward. So with the A-Cat rig being, roughly around 30 feet long, it's a very high aspect ratio rig, has fantastic span efficiency, and we simply just didn't need any more tipping moment. We just needed to allow the boat to go forward. So the foiling and even in upwind displacement mode, the reduced area in the head and the slightly increased area in the bottom and the deck ceiling of the mainsail has made the rigs much more versatile and much cleaner and more powerful and more efficient upwind. And obviously the foiling upwind side of things is where you'd really take the big benefit for sort of bottom loading the rig, if you like. So putting an efficient, clean area down low, but just having the span efficiency of the height of the rig in the different conditions works really well. So that sort of morphed the sails into slightly smaller heads than what we've previously seen. And even in displacement sailing, if it's relatively breezy, I think the slightly smaller head and the new plan form would even suit a lot of the sort of classic boats, if you like, particularly upwind is where you'll see the biggest gain out of that. So that's really the evolution of the big head back to the old school.
Yeah, Glenn, before we move on from sales, did you do a lot of testing, or was it more just sort of trial by by your understanding and your numbers, or did you actually look at the difference between the larger head sails to the small head and the deck sweeper closing off the foot? Like, did you have any sort of numbers or any sort of percentages that you think of efficiency that were increased with these new sails?
Yeah, look, it's been something that had been talked about quite a bit. Having a chat back in, I think it was probably about 2013 with some of our designers and engineers. You sort of have a coffee and have a bit of a chat about where things are sort of heading, and obviously with the foiling side of things coming into place. And it was pretty clear that the rigs needed to evolve in a certain direction, and we started having a play around with that in sort of 2014, and then after only one or two test sails, it was fairly clear that with this new sort of foiling program coming on board, that we needed to make some pretty drastic changes to the sails. And yeah, there was a lot of effort, I think, from a lot of sail makers at that particular period of time in testing and developing, and it continues on to this day. We're certainly not perfect by any means, but I think the biggest sort of change was the foiling side of things, and I think particularly the upwind foiling, and the new sails make upwind foiling so much easier than what the old ones do. The boat just wants to go forwards more naturally by itself. You can throw a little bit of main sheet to get going and then slowly squeeze it on as you build speed. And the new sails and the new rigs just do that so much better than what the old big head ones used to do. So it's the boats have become easier and quicker.
The one thing with foiling that we've seen, especially with the rigs, is the load has increased significantly. Like the main sheet, we've had to manufacture blocks to be able to withhold the load that the boats are seeing. I mean, basically one of the reasons we came up with the 30 mil high load block was we couldn't find a block that wasn't breaking at the back of the boat that was small and efficient enough to do the job that we needed. So, yeah, I mean, when you ease a bit of sheet and try to pull it back on going upwind on one of these boats when they're doing that 20, 25 sort of knots, you've got a bit on your hands there. So, that's foiling's definitely generated that. Another thing that's happened at the same time with rigs, with going from big head to small head, is seeing tapered masts come in. And there's a few different variants. There's basically only one manufacturer these days, being Fiberfoam. About probably 98% of the fleet use a Fiberfoam mast. There's a 6.3 hound and a 6.5 hound mast. What have you seen with the mast that's helped the new sails as well?
Yeah, look, the rig development and the mast development's been, one of the beauties, if you like, of the class over the years. And I think, a lot of the manufacturers and, certainly spending time with Scotty Anderson, over the years, and the way they've developed their rigs to, match the way people sail the boats and the sails has been excellent. And you know, the tapered mast versus the non-tapered mast, in a strict aerodynamic sort of theory sense, the tapered mast should be slightly better than a non-tapered mast. But the masts are, you know, they're tapered in their laminate, so the way they bend and the way they curve and the way they operate is in a tapered sense, and that's done with the manufacturing in the laminate schedule of the actual mast themselves. So having used a tapered mast, a 6.3 hound, a 6.5 hound, and a standard mast, you know, at a 6.3 and a 6.5 as well, a non-tapered, there's very little difference between the rigs. The most important thing is actually getting your batten set up correctly and actually getting a sail that suits your weight and setting up the rig for your weight and the way that you sail a boat. So, yeah, I mean, I could sort of put my finger on it and say the tapered mast was possibly a little more friendly to use in the uprange conditions. And I could potentially say that the non-tapered mast for me was a little nicer to use in the downrange conditions. And this is a couple of years ago, so things change all the time. But both masts were excellent, and I think you know, the sails can be developed for either of those masts really easily, and you know, they get through a massive range. So you know, they're great rigs.
Definitely. I mean, Scotty's done a long time and put a great effort into it. And to be honest, you don't really see the rigs breaking that much anymore. So he's not only has he put it into performance, but he's put it into longevity of the rigs as well. So it's big kudos to Scotty Anderson at Fiberfoam, that's for sure.
Yeah, so Glenn, sticking with rigs, obviously we're pretty limited with controls on the rigs to, you know, diamond tension, spreader sweep, spreader length. Obviously, you being, you know, the main sail maker to the class for many years, and your involvement, you've obviously seen some evolutions from different luff curve. You know, we started out pretty straight and then went really bendy and kind of back to a little bit straighter now. And I know that you're always sort of changing and making adjustments to your rig. Obviously, that's not totally practical for everyone, but what would you say is the key elements for those being diamond tension and spreader angle that the average A-Cat guy should really sort of focus on?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a sort of I guess a medium setting that generally most sort of people use. For example, what one of our you know, settings for our standard rig setup would be roughly running about sort of 50 to 60 mils of spreader rake, for example, and running around about sort of 35 mils, 40 mils of pre-bend. That's sort of a you know, a 10 to 15 knot medium sort of setting. As it gets lighter, you could go forwards on your, once you've got your pre-bend set and your diamond tension set to achieve those numbers, you could then go forwards 2 or 3 turns on your spreaders for lighter conditions, sort of just on trapeze, just foiling conditions. And then in uprange conditions, you could potentially go up a few millimeters on your diamond wires to run a little more tension, a little more pre-bend, but then also go back to even 80, even 90 millimeters of spreader rake in the windier conditions, which just allow the mast to bend a little more easily through that midsection, particularly fore and aft, upwind. So, you know, we don't need extra power, you know, when you're sailing in more than about 8 or 9 knots on the A-Cat. So it's all about making the rig clean and tidy and actually, you know, having a really good span efficiency of the rig. So that's sort of a rough guide as to where, you know, where I'd set my rig up to, and using our standard sails. And basically, you know, if you're a little bit heavier or a little bit lighter, you will sort of hedge a little bit more one way or the other depending on your weight. So for a light guy, for example, they'll be sort of at a more uprange setup for what a heavy guy would be earlier in the range. So, you know, when in doubt, have a play, you know, try some different settings. You know, during a regatta, I'll be, you know, fiddling around and we'll be adjusting our spreaders fore and aft and you know, putting stiffer battens in up high if it's windier and that sort of thing. And all the little tiny adjustments added up, that makes the little bit of a difference. The little bit of a difference between, a duck and a cross can make the difference between getting out, cleanly and not. So it's all those little pieces added up together that really make a difference.
Yeah. Now, my favourite part of this interview so far is that Ben actually wrote those numbers down. So this interview is doing exactly what it's supposed to and helping people go forward with their A-class sailing. So thanks, Ben. You've added very much to this interview. Well done.
There's definitely a few questions in there that are for my benefit. So I'm glad. The other one, while we're on the basics of mast setup, obviously rotation has a huge performance change in the boat. Obviously, go out to boat with your buddies, play around with different settings, but visually, what are you really looking at if you're out sailing by yourself and just playing with rotation positions and settings? What's your sort of rule of thumb? Obviously, when it feels good, you can tell when a boat's going fast, but obviously somebody of your caliber, you probably spend a lot more time analyzing and playing around with that. So if you could explain that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Basically, on all our standard sails, there's a set of telltales that are roughly about sort of 2.5 meters off the deck, that are about 30 mils or an inch or so behind the mast track. Those telltales are really the telltales that you look at to adjust your mast rotation in an upwind sailing mode. So if the leeward telltale is starting to break just behind the mast, that means you've got your mast rotation too far inboard. So you'll have to ease the mast out just until that leeward telltale starts to flow. That's about the max in position that you'll ever want your mast rotation. Downwind, I use the upper luff telltales, which are generally around the A-class logo vicinity. Those telltales downwind are the ones that you actually use and look at to adjust your mast rotation for downwind, because you sail with a slightly different twist profile downwind than what you do upwind. So if the windward one is sort of hanging off and starting to blow around, it means you can pull your mast rotation in a little bit. Generally, in flat water conditions, you can pull your mast rotation in just until you start to see that leeward one break, and then just drop it out a tiny bit. And if your rig's locked in and you're fairly steady, that's a really fast position. If it's a bit choppier, generally you'll want to see the windward one break a little more than what the leeward one is, because if the leeward one breaks, you generally get disturbed flow or detached flow right across the leeward side of the sail, and then that can create quite a big stall where you sort of plonk down, and then you've got to do a big heat up again to get attached flow and get going. So that's generally the rule of thumb for me. So lower luff telltales for upwind and upper luff telltales for downwind mast rotation settings.
Awesome. All right, well, we'll get into the last topic, and that's the sailing techniques, uphill and downhill. So uphill foiling, it's not the easiest thing to do, and also, as I said previously, can be a bit scary, a bit daunting once you're up there. How the hell do you get it down? So do you want to run us through what you do to make the boat foil uphill?
Yeah, sure. I think roughly around sort of 10 to 11 knots of true wind speed from memory is about the crossover point from where displacement sailing and foiling upwind, sort of the VMG crosses over, if you like. You'll always be slightly lower sailing upwind in 10 to 11 knots when you just start foiling, and that will be dictated by all things, fleet positioning, wind shifts, persistent sides of the course that you're wanting to get to. So that's sort of ultimately the crossover. If it's a puffy, shifty day around that sort of 9 to 12 knot range, for example, you may decide to go into a foiling mode for a little while, sail into a lull, and then do a nice coast up into displacement mode. And that's where you can really make some big gains over your opponents if you do that well. Generally, you'll want to be full Cunningham before you actually even attempt to go into a foiling mode. Basically, in the lighter conditions, it's a concerted effort to put the bow down, really build your speed to around 14 to 15 knots before you even try and pop the boat out of the water. You can do it slightly earlier if your skills are really good, but generally you'll need to put the bow down quite a bit. You won't make the gain initially, but it's a long-term game. It's something that you won't see generally a gain for potentially even sort of 30 seconds versus someone that's in displacement mode. So anything above 12 knots, you basically need to be foiling upwind if you're wanting to win a foiling race. The boat needs to be sailed at least flat or slightly windward heel. What you don't want to do is ever get yourself in a position where you get leeward heel. That's really, really slow. So windward heel, keeping the windward knuckle of the dagger board always immersed is really key. You can have the leeward dagger board knuckle, which is hard to see obviously from the windward side, but if someone takes a photo, you'll sort of work out where you are. You want to have that leeward knuckle either just piercing the surface or just out in an ideal world. So you're really driving hard off your windward dagger board, and the leeward dagger board will be sort of lifting, and that curve, if you like, or that angle, the vector of that lift is actually rolling the boat slightly to windward. So that's actually giving you a slight riding moment increase as well, and the windward dagger board is actually pulling down slightly. So downwind in general, you can sail the boat flat. Occasionally, if you're doing a fast mode, you'll sail windward heel, but generally around zero is fairly nice and comfortable. So both knuckles of the dagger board just in or just out is okay. You don't want to have the full shaft immersed. Generally, you'll set your rake up and the ride height of the boat basically to have those knuckles of the dagger boards, just using them as your sort of final heave stability. So you want them basically just piercing the surface, and then you'll weight shift around that to keep them basically at the surface with a level trim going downwind. So yeah, downwind's obviously, the boat wants to foil a lot easier downwind than it does upwind, but really the upwind is where the big gains are at. Tacking, you can actually foil the boat right up into and almost through the breeze and almost foil tack the boat and land it on the new hull, if you like. That's quite tricky, and you can throw yourself off the boat quite easily. But even once you're foiling, if you do a really nice smooth turn up into displacement mode, then do a normal tack, that'll be a really good VMG gain tack. And that's obviously where there's some massive gains in the manoeuvres as well. Same thing with jibing downwind. If you can keep the boat foiling right the way through the jibe, land the hull just briefly as you hook on trapeze and jump back out again, air forward the whole way, that can turn into a massive gain as well. Some of the biggest gains and losses, I think, in the A-class fleet are tacking and jibing and mark rounding. So they're the things that I go out and practice when I'm by myself. Straight line sailing's easy, everybody can do it, and you can practice that till the cows come home. But around a racetrack, the biggest gains are at the corners, I think, and boat handling is certainly a massive one for making good gains.
With the uphill foiling, is there a trick or a tip for the initial pop? Like I found myself that I'd, bow down a little bit and ease a little bit of sheet to help the boat pop up, and I wouldn't sheet on again to where I wanted to be until a boat really accelerated, and then I would sheet on, and then I'd use the sheet as basically my ride height. So if I wanted to come down off the foils, I'd sheet on harder and almost stall the sail a bit, and it would come down. But if that was happening naturally, I'd ease a bit of sheet to ride high again and, free up the boat and get going. So is that something that you were seeing as well?
Yeah, look, it's a really good point, and absolutely, to get the bow down, you'll need to ease a little bit of main sheet, and by having your traveller centred, twisting the main sheet, you're lowering your centre of effort, you're side loading the foils more, which gives them more lift and helps the boat pop out of the water. Absolutely, you need to eventually sheet the main back on, but by sheeting the main on too early, you won't actually allow the boat to sort of get over the hump and keep accelerating. But if you don't sheet on at the right time, you'll just be bleeding off your height too, and going fast, but you'll be way too low. So what a really good trick is, I think, is for the guys that are sort of getting into it, is to run a speedo or a GPS. And really, your boat speed shouldn't get less than 16 knots, give or take. 15.5 knots would be the slowest that you ever want to really comfortably foil at. And if you're doing more than sort of 21 knots upwind, you're probably sailing the boat too fast. So if you're targeting around 18 to 19 knots of boat speed upwind, that's a really good way of modulating how much main sheet, if you like, you've got on, to keep that speed consistent. And really what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep your speed consistent. So if you get a puff, you'll take it in height, keep your speed, for your foil settings, you'll have a rudder setup and a foil setup that you'll want to maintain a certain speed. So if you're wanting to do a faster mode, you'll have to generally reduce your daggerboard lift, or you'll have to go slightly further weight forward to keep the boat at the right height. If you're foiling slightly slower, you'll end up needing to be weight shift a little further aft for the same daggerboard and rudder setup. So having a speedo and getting a really good feel of what your boat speed is, I think both upwind and downwind are a really good way of sailing the boat accurately and consistently, and then you can take the speedo off once you've got the feel for it. But the speedo is a good way of modulating your speed accurately.
Perfect. And so you get around the top mark, you've done your uphill foiling, perfect, and you bear away to go around the top mark. Are you dropping traveller, or are you just trying to boost that speed that you've gained from the big bear away and just getting deep into the course as quickly as you can? Like what's the benefit you're trying to get out of this?
Yeah, so generally in lighter conditions, you might only drop sort of 50 or 100 millimetres of traveller from when you get going around the clearing mark to downwind. If it's sort of 15 to 20 knots of breeze, for example, where you've got a lot of wind speed but not an excessive amount of boat speed, your apparent wind angle will go aft quite a lot. So you definitely need to ease the traveller down, to keep the flow attached nicely on the bottom part of the rig, but also mean that you're not too twisted. And by being too twisted is actually, you're too draggy. So what you want to do is basically be able to keep your traveller down, keep your main sheet tension fairly high. So you've got a nice, even, sort of nice span loaded sail, and fairly flat. You definitely don't need an excess of depth downwind when it's windy. So I'd often only ease 20 to 25 millimetres of Cunningham from fully on upwind to downwind. It's really important that you ease that 20 to 25 millimetres of Cunningham as you go around the top mark, because you'll actually overload or overstress the sail, and that causes premature sail degradation by not easing a little bit of Cunningham. So by popping that sort of 20 mils off or 25 mils off, you can twist the sail a little bit, you can go traveller down, and then you can ease your mast rotation and sheet the sail back on. And that'll make the boat much more forgiving to sail downwind while you're on trapeze. You can often be up to sort of 400, 500, 600 millimetres down on the traveller if it's really windy and really wavy conditions where you are touching the hull down and kissing, and the apparent wind will be further aft. If you're comfortably foiling and the water's flat and the wind is steady, you can sheet on hard and you can be traveller in a little bit and really heat the boat up and sail a faster mode. But generally sea state, as it gets windier, is the biggest killer on the A-Cat. That's where you really have to sort of, quite often, the top market might be flatter if it's an offshore day, and by the time you get sort of halfway down the track towards the bottom market, it gets quite wavy, and that's where you really need to change gears and change the setup of the boat, for example, for the bottom half of the course versus the top half. Or if it's a really wavy conditions day, you need to make sure you set the boat up so it's just easy to sail and you can get the head out of the boat.
Right, perfect. You got anything you want to add to finish this off, Ben?
I'm going to just reverse back to the rig settings again. The one thing that we didn't talk about that I know everyone always asks and not really sure where is rake setting. Is there like a standard rule of thumb? Do you change it? What's your thought processes?
Yeah, I think back in the old days, Ben, displacement sailing wise, I think we did used to change the rake around quite a lot more. I think these days with the sort of the foiling, I found that I haven't really been playing with the rake a huge amount. I'd only adjust it probably one hole on the Ronstan side stay adjuster from light air to heavy air, which is sort of probably an 8 or 8.5 mil change from heavy air to light air. So generally not moving it around a whole lot. I'll find that you get a nice setting that works well through the conditions, and not a whole lot. I think the classic boat guys would probably end up moving their rigs fore and aft a little more, from the lighter conditions to when they're sailing in breezier conditions. But I think with the foiling boats, because you're sort of foiling downwind in sort of 6.5 knots, the rig rake's not as important as what it used to be back in the old days. So it's not something that I change often.
Great. Well, I suppose we'll wrap it up. You've got a very busy day ahead of you. I don't know if you're going out in the water today, and
We are.
Perfect. Well, you've got a better day than us. So, yeah, thank you so much. You've been a great supporter of Ronstan for many years now, since you started with the A's, or even probably prior to that with the Paper Tigers. So we appreciate you coming on board and helping us out and helping out the A-class community, as you are definitely seen as the god of A's. So hopefully this interview goes out there and helps a lot of people.
Yeah,
Nice, guys.
yeah, Glennie, definitely thank you. Thanks a ton for all of this. Give my regards to Mel and the family. It's yeah, these years sort of tick over quicker than what we realise, but it's always good to run into you guys, and I hope after the Cup you guys you know, find some time back in Australia. But one quick question: any chance of you and the Team New Zealand guys coming to the Worlds next year after all your AC stuff's done? And
Definitely a possibility, Benny. The way it's all panned out, you know, the last sort of couple of months have definitely shaken things up. So definitely not counting it out for sure. I'd love to come over and see you guys. So we'll see how things go.
yeah, awesome.
Nice,
Perfect.
guys.
Right. Thank you, mate. We appreciate you coming on board, and we'll speak soon.
Sounds great.
Yeah, good luck with everything, Glenn. Cheers, mate.
Thanks, guys. See ya.